When I was a disreputable youth and I spent my time being ferried around in a Mark II Ford Escort 1300L, 3 models up from the base spec, the distinction between what was a luxury car and what was something us mere proles used to get us to and from work or school, of course, Mom, that distinction was pretty clear. But with EVs, the situation has got a little more muddy because a lot of things that were once the domain of luxury vehicles have become something that mere peasants like us can have. So have EVs narrowed that difference? Now, the first part of this conversation is obviously to some extent about affordability. At least in the US, I can count the range of truly affordable EVs on, at best, one hand. Realistically, I don't actually need a hand at all, because the Chevrolet Bolt, even with the federal tax rebate, even for folks who are eligible for all of that tax rebate, only just scrapes into the semi-affordable vehicles category when new. And while the cost of ownership will be way lower than for its combustion engine siblings, that's not an argument that generally goes over well when trying to borrow money for a purchase, because banks are somehow reticent to believe the argument that it will save you money in the long term when compared to the alternative. But that said, the Bolt EV, its sibling the Bolt EUV, and its other expensive but not quite so expensive as most of them electric relatives from other automakers are, in general, far better in traditional vehicle terms than they have any right to be. It used to be that as you moved from vehicles intended for the cheaper end of the mass market to increasingly upmarket vehicles, you had a huge leap in quality of materials, of passenger comfort, and of ride comfort. It has been that way since the dawn of the automobile, where the interiors of high-end luxury cars were comparable to the very best horse-drawn carriages, whereas the very first affordable cars had the same kind of creature comforts you'd expect from a farm cart. I vividly recall the first time I rode in a Mercedes S-Class and how it felt compared to my family's mid-spec Vauxhall Cavalier. Let's just say it was different. And there were a number of reasons for that. Some were simply down to the solidity of the vehicle. Luxury vehicles often used a thicker gauge of metal, which had significant impacts on sound and the feel of vehicles. Underfoot plush woolen carpets displaced the cheaper car's nylon or even simple rubber mats found in more workaday vehicles, and well-padded and trimmed leather upholstery replaced the more bare-bones fabric seats. And there was also build time. If you're charging people more for the car, it can spend longer being fettled, being built with real care and attention without impacting your bottom line. But it was also a time when computer modelling and the understanding of how sound is transmitted was not near as advanced as it is now. The solution to making the interior quiet was often to simply throw in a metric butt-ton of sound-deadening material. And additions like that were expensive. To automakers attempting to capitalise on the vehicles with thinner profit margins, sound deadening and making the car body thinner were easy ways to shave off the pennies. These days, automakers have access to a raft of noise engineering tools that allow them to much more accurately pinpoint and address specific causes of noise, vibration and harshness in vehicles, a topic we discussed in more detail in a video last year about whether EVs are better for your health. We'll put a link up there and down there. But not only is it easier than ever for automakers to identify those problem noise areas and eliminate or mitigate them cheaply, EVs also have vastly fewer of the things that generate noise than older suck, squeeze, bang, blow powered vehicles. And while squeaks and rattles in EVs are, for the engineers, a spectacular pain in the posterior because the drivetrain simply doesn't make enough noise to hide them.
Wrong! The shh doesn't come from the distributors. It's the vibrations in the dilithium disbursement manifold. It's like this.
No, guys, it's like this.
It does mean that vehicles themselves are naturally much quieter. That's why noisemakers are required for EVs in many countries, to make sure those who rely more on hearing than vision are able to safely hear an EV approaching at low speed. Okay, so EVs start off quieter, and the technology to identify where noises come from has got better, so even cheap cars can be quiet with some good and not vastly expensive engineering up front, rather than throwing expensive materials at noise problems later. At the top end of the market, the fact that to get decent range EVs need to either be lighter or automakers have to stump up for massive batteries with a cost implication that doesn't easily get passed on to the consumer if they don't come with a concomitant range increase, has also driven a shift that means that you can't simply throw that enormous quantity of soundproofing and a ton of carpet at a vehicle to make its cabin quieter. It's driven enhancements in the materials used to achieve soundproofing. Switching from shoddy fibre, which isn't just me being rude, it's the name for non-woven fibre mats often used for soundproofing, or its alternatives, foam and polyethylene tetrachloride, or PET, switching from those with their associated adhesives to liquid applied sound deadening can result in a weight drop of around 3/4 kilo, or around 1.5 pounds per metre square covered. That significant change in the materials used, along with decreasing the cost of components and sound deadening materials, combined with the increasing mechanisation of vehicle assembly and the advent of LASD, means there's been a huge drop in both the labour cost and the materials cost to install enough soundproofing, such that even EVs at the more affordable end of the market mostly have very good soundproofing. Akbar Hussaini, BASF's technical specialist for noise, vibration and harshness, points out that during manufacturing, prior to the development of LASD materials, you might have required one person per door to install the mats in a time-consuming and difficult process. That means you might have had 2 to 6 people per shift over 3 shifts installing them. Those pads are also heavy, often produce dust that got into the vehicles and the work environment and probably the workers, and led to high levels of VOCs being produced, all of which combined meant an increase in risk to workers for a product that didn't necessarily work as well. Replacing that process, as many companies have, with spray-on substances that produces a continuous coating that can be applied robotically in just a couple of minutes, reduces cost, complexity, and thanks to more modern compositions with lower VOCs, can help companies meet climate targets. Also, unlike traditional butyl mats, which had to be individually die-cut and couldn't necessarily cover the interior of a panel or all the bits that you wanted to cover, the spray material can cover much more of a panel when necessary in a continuous layer, producing better noise reduction effect. There have also been similar improvements in expanding foams used to fill box section and prevent resonance. All of that means that you can get better noise reduction for lower cost. And in terms of new materials, we also have to consider the increased drive towards recycled, reclaimed and circular economy materials. Particularly, we've noticed in the interiors and touch surfaces, substances that, unlike traditional interior trim materials, are accessible to other mid-segment automakers without as much of a compromise. We saw this in the Kia Niro EV, which has a headliner made from recycled wallpaper mixed with recycled polyethylene tetrachloride, or PET. It sounds weird, but feels great. We're seeing more and more bio-leather, which is generally made from vegetable materials combined with polyurethane. In Aptera's Delta prototype, there was pineapple leather. We've felt, seen and caressed various veneers, and we've also seen the tedious continuation of the fingerprint magnet piano black as accent elements in both luxury and in more prosaic vehicles. There is also one other thing which I think needs to be said. It's often new entrant automakers that drive down entry-level vehicle pricing while pushing specifications up. In the 70s, Japanese automakers entered the Western market with vehicles that drove down prices while pushing up expectations because those vehicles were often far better equipped than their Western counterparts. Korean automakers entered in the 90s, and in the early noughties, or aughts, or whatever you want to call them, we saw Tesla entering the market and shifting what people expected from a mid-range and luxury sedans. And now we've seen Malaysian and Chinese automakers very successfully entering the European and now American markets, and along with that will come another round of changes in expectations because these vehicles are often remarkably well equipped for their price point. And at this point, that seems to have driven some rather weird things like the blingification of Mercedes-Benz, Genesis, Lexus and BMW interiors. If you told 15-year-old me that in 2023 a Mercedes-Benz could effectively look like the inside of a rave if you set the lighting just right, or that Genesis would release a high-end vehicle with an orb of power. All praise the orb. I'd have been very confused. And not just because Genesis didn't exist when I was 15, but that is in part because when you get into the newest EVs, even more so the electric-only platforms, what differentiates the Prolmobiles from the Luxo barges is no longer how quiet they are, it's no longer how comfortable they are, or even how quick they charge. It's gradations of having 10-way adjustable seats instead of 6. It's having acoustic glass on the side windows as well as the windshield. It's having photochromic light reduction on your glass roof instead of a blind. That doesn't mean there aren't differences you might really feel. It's still common for lower-end vehicles to have, for example, torsion beam suspension at the rear instead of an independent rear suspension setup. So if you're a spirited driver, you will feel that compromise. And we're increasingly seeing air suspension or complex adaptive suspension configurations on higher-end vehicles. But honestly, after a year of driving a lot of luxury vehicles, what struck me is how much I don't miss them when they're gone. They're just not that much better than my mid-range daily driver. Lower-end EVs are that much better than low-end gas cars precisely because they are quieter and smoother, and the low down weight of the battery pack often compensates for other cut corners. And sure, you can spend 100 grand on a status symbol, but it's becoming increasingly common that you can get that comfort and reliability for far less. But that said, we've seen and pointed out that time and time again automakers are choosing to bling up their otherwise pedestrian cars with massage seats, 15-inch touchscreens and enough LEDs to light up the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree, just so they can claim some kind of luxury credentials and tack another 15 grand on the asking price. And that's a trend that we can't wait to see the end of. And on that note, we're done with today's video. If you liked it, you know what to do, and feel free to tip us with a super thanks. The comments are open for your thoughts, as is our Discord chat room. Links down there. If you want more, subscribe, hit the bell, and follow the links below to regularly support us with a YouTube membership or a Patreon subscription. You'll also find links to our Ko-fi, Bitcoin, and our Swag store. And check us out on Mastodon. We have our very own server. Scrolling by on my right, look at them there, is the list of amazing charged up supporters. And shout outs go to our self-driving tier supporters Mike Weeder, Linda Irish, Sean Tucker, Patrick Boyarski, Paul Nelson, Chris Maxwell, Brian Newton, Michael Goad, Bennett Elder, Andrew Martin, Pedro Muro Pinheiro, Brophy Wolf, Chris and Michael Johnson, Tezza in the Gong, Dan Blair, Peter Dillinger, Gordon C, Stephen O'Donoghue, Kyle Hodgson, Anthony Coates, Raging Fellows, Denny Hyde, Chrissa Center, and Jim Burness. Finally, out of this world thanks to our Starman supporters Andrew Glenn, Anonymous Freak, JP Fagerback, Joe Bresney, John Lyons, Rory Litwin, Kevin Burrabridge, Dave Kitchen, Aaron Hunn, Laura Reynolds, Marcel Ward, Matthew Drobnak, Paul Conway, Reggie Watts, Will Graylan, and of course, Ian. We'll be back soon with more videos, but until then, keep evolving.